Welcome to Cliveden or Cliveden. It's pronounced both ways. Before we introduce the next field trip, let's think back to your last trip using the 5 W's and 1 H. What is the name of the first house you visited? Who lived there? Who worked there? When was the house built? How was the house built? What did the house look like? Where was it located? And why was that house important? Turn and talk. Quickly turn to the person next to you and share one thing you learned about life in colonial Pennsylvania from Stenton. On your next field trip, you will visit Clifton. Benjamin Jew lived at Clifton, and he was a lawyer and Chief Justice. In 1767, he had Clifton built as a summer home and moved there with his wife and 13 children. Who worked at Clifton? Servants, a gardener, a coachman, a nursemaid for the children, and laundry maids were all paid workers at Clifton. Benjamin Jew also owned enslaved Africans, and some of them worked at Clifton. Many more enslaved Africans worked on Benjamin Jew's plantations in Delaware and Maryland. Below are a few modern photos of some of the plantations that he owned. But how do we know about the people who worked at Clifton? The Jew Papers is a collection of 230,000 documents kept by the Jew family. What kind of source are the Jew Papers if they were actually written by the Jew family? That's right, it's a primary source, and these sources provided some information about the people who lived and worked at Clifton. Now let's talk about the American Revolution. What is a revolution? Raise your hand if you think you know the answer. A revolution is a change in the way a country is governed. Usually, it's a change to a different political system, sometimes using violence or war. During the time Stenton and Clifton were built, Pennsylvania was not a state. It was a colony. What is a colony? A colony is a place that is settled at a distance from the country that governs it. Pennsylvania and 12 other colonies made up the 13 original colonies ruled by King George of England. Does the King of England still run Pennsylvania today? Who is in charge of the United States of America today? Governments today make their money through taxes. And just like today, citizens of England had to pay taxes to the king when they lived in the 13 colonies. And that's how the government had money to run the country and its colonies. A citizen is a member of a nation. Let's discuss the causes of the American Revolution. The French and Indian War took place between the American colonies and New France. Both sides allied with various Native American tribes. This war lasted from 1754 to 1763. British troops not only helped the colonists fight the war, but they were stationed in the colonies for protection after the war. These troops cost money, and Britain needed money to pay the troops. so the British Parliament decided to tax the American colonies to help pay for the troops. Before 1764, the British government had pretty much left the colonists alone to govern themselves. But after the French and Indian War, they began to impose new laws and taxes on the colonists. They implemented a number of laws, including the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Quartering Act, and the Stamp Act. The colonists were not happy with the new taxes. They said they should not have to pay British taxes because they had no representation in the British Parliament. Their motto became no taxation without representation. But what does representation mean? Discuss this as a class. Many colonists began to protest against these new British taxes and laws. A group called the Sons of Liberty formed in 1765 in Boston and soon spread throughout the colonies. During one protest in Boston, a fight broke out and several colonists were killed. This incident became known as the Boston Massacre. In 1773, the British imposed a new tax on tea. Several colonists in Boston protested this act by boarding ships in the Boston harbor and dumping their tea into the water. This protest became known as the Boston Tea Party. The British then decided that the colonies needed to be punished for the Boston Tea Party. The British issued a number of new laws that the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. One of the intolerable acts was the Boston Port Act, which shut down the port of Boston for trade. British ships blocked Boston Harbor, punishing everyone who lived in Boston. This angered not only the people in Boston, but also people in other colonies who were afraid the British would do the same thing to them. How do you think all of this made the colonists feel? The increased laws punishing the colonies did little to control the colonies like the British had hoped, but actually it had the opposite effect. The laws caused the colonies to become more united against the British, and many colonies sent supplies to help Boston during the blockade. Also, more and more colonists throughout the Americas joined up with the Sons of Liberty. And in 1774, 12 of the 13 colonies sent representatives to the First Continental Congress as a direct response to the Intolerable Acts. They sent a petition to King George to repeal or get rid of the Intolerable Acts. They never got a response. In 1775, British soldiers in Massachusetts were ordered to disarm the American rebels and arrest their leaders. The Revolutionary War began on April 19, 1775, when fighting broke out between the two sides at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Next came the Declaration of Independence. The Continental Congress decided the colonies needed to be independent from Britain. Thomas Jefferson was given the job of writing this declaration, and when he was finished, he gave a copy to Benjamin Franklin and John Adams to read and edit. The Declaration lists specific reasons the colonists wanted to break free from Britain. Some of these examples were for quartering large bodies of armed troops, which means colonists were forced to house British troops. Another reason was for cutting off trade with all parts of the world. Remember, back to the Boston blockade. Another reason was for imposing taxes without their consent. Remember, taxation without representation. And on July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. But how do you think the King of England felt about the Declaration of Independence? let's take a closer look at one of the most important sentences in the Declaration of Independence. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." It talks about equality and rights. The right to live, the right to liberty or freedom, and the right to do what makes you happy. But look at this sentence and think about what you know about history. Who does this statement talk about? And who was not included in this statement? Choosing sides. Once the war began in the colonies, it was a confusing and difficult time for everyone in the colonies. The people who supported the revolution called themselves patriots. They were willing to fight for freedom and independence. They wanted a new country free from England. People who supported the British called themselves loyalists. They were staying loyal to the king and kept their promise to remain with the old country. Others chose not to fight at all. This is called staying neutral. Why might someone decide to stay neutral? Raise your hand if you have an idea. Did everyone get to choose a side? Who might not have been able to fight for their freedom? Women weren't technically allowed to fight in the war. What about enslaved Africans? Was the freedom the patriots were fighting for the same freedom that enslaved people desired? So what does all of this have to do with Cliveden? In 1777, the British Army captured Philadelphia, and the British general, William Howe, marched through Germantown on his way to Philadelphia. General George Washington planned a surprise attack on the British in Germantown on the morning of October 4th, 1777. Benjamin Jew's house had about 100 British soldiers barricaded inside, and the Battle of Germantown took place that morning as British soldiers fired out of the windows down onto George Washington's army. The Patriots lost that battle and retreated to Valley Forge for the winter. Each year, Clifton reenacts the Battle of Germantown, so you can see what the battle actually looked like. Here are some modern photographs of the reenactment that takes place every year the first Saturday in October. After the war, and after the Battle of Germantown in 1777, Benjamin Jew sold Cliveden, but then repurchased it in 1797. In the 20th century, the family converted Cliveden and its carriage house to include more modern amenities like heating and electricity. But a fire in 1970 burned the carriage house, so Sam Jew gave the property to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Today, Cliveden is a museum and no Jews live at Cliveden. Looking ahead to your field trip, what do you think Cliveden can teach us about Benjamin Jew and the people who lived at Cliveden? What do you think we can learn about the battle during your visit? Reminder, you learned about the rules for visiting a house museum at Stenton. Let's review them as a class before we go. Raise your hand if you remember an important rule. And enjoy your visit to Cliveden.